Ma'am, take off your coat. The command echoed across the quiet drugstore with such sudden force that every shopping cart seemed to stop moving at once. Conversations faded into silence. A child holding a box of cereal looked up. An elderly couple near the pharmacy counter turned their heads. Even the cashier froze with her hand resting on the register. Evelyn Carter stood perfectly still beneath the bright fluorescent lights, one hand wrapped around a small paper pharmacy bag, the other clutching a folded prescription receipt. At 74 years old, she had spent a lifetime learning how quickly an ordinary afternoon could become something else. The store smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol, fresh coffee from the convenience aisle, and the lemon-scented cleaner that lingered on polished tile floors. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted long golden reflections across the parking lot, but inside, everything suddenly felt cold. Officer Daniel Red stepped closer, his polished badge catching the overhead light. His expression remained firm, almost rehearsed, as though he had already decided how this encounter would end before speaking a single word. Beside him stood Officer Blake Turner, silent, watchful, shifting his weight from one boot to the other without saying anything. Behind the checkout counter, store manager Linda Hayes folded her arms tightly across her chest. She had been the one who called the police only minutes earlier after telling dispatch that an elderly woman had been acting suspiciously near the pharmacy shelves. Suspicious. Evelyn quietly repeated the word in her mind, wondering how someone buying heart medication could ever become suspicious. She slowly raised the pharmacy bag just enough for everyone to see. "My husband's prescription," she said gently. Her voice carried neither anger nor fear, only the calm steadiness that comes from decades of choosing dignity over argument. Reed barely glanced at the label. "We received a report," he replied. "Please remove your coat and place your belongings on the counter." Around them, curious shoppers exchanged uncertain looks but quickly lowered their eyes again. No one wanted to become involved. A young pharmacy technician looked toward Linda as if expecting her to correct the misunderstanding, but Linda simply stared at Evelyn without speaking. The silence grew heavier with every passing second. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the paper bag. Inside rested a bottle of heart medication her husband had only enough of for 2 more days. Harold Carter had been waiting at home in his recliner, believing his wife would return within 30 minutes just as she always did after picking up his prescriptions. She had promised she would stop by the bakery on the way home and surprise him with his favorite cinnamon rolls. Now the thought drifted farther away with every heartbeat. Evelyn inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising almost imperceptibly beneath her light blue coat. "Officer," she said with quiet respect, "before we go any further, would you please look at the security cameras? They'll show exactly where I've been since I walked through those front doors." Reed's jaw tightened for only a moment before returning to the same unreadable expression. "We'll decide what we need to review," he answered. Somewhere near aisle 7, a bottle rolled gently off a shelf after being bumped by an unattended shopping cart. The soft plastic sound echoed through the motionless store like the ticking of a clock. Evelyn looked toward the ceiling where the small black security cameras watched every aisle without emotion. They recorded everything. They judged no one. And unlike the people standing around her, they never looked away. Evelyn lowered the pharmacy bag onto the counter exactly as she had been instructed, smoothing the wrinkled paper with slow, careful hands that had spent nearly 5 decades tending gardens, preparing family dinners, and buttoning little jackets before school on cold autumn mornings. There was nothing hurried about her movements. She knew that sudden gestures often made nervous people even more suspicious, and she had learned long ago that patience sometimes spoke louder than explanations. The receipt rested neatly beside the prescription bottle, every line printed clearly with her husband's name, Harold Carter, along with the dosage prescribed by his cardiologist only 2 days earlier. The pharmacist behind the counter glanced toward the paperwork, then toward Officer Reed, hesitating as though unsure whether to speak. Evelyn noticed the hesitation but said nothing. She understood that fear often wore the face of silence. Harold had always told her that courage was not measured by how loudly someone defended the truth, but by whether they chose to recognize it when it appeared. They had been married for 51 years. Together they had survived layoffs, hurricanes, rising prices, family illnesses, and neighborhoods that slowly changed around them. Through every season of life, Harold carried the same quiet smile, and Evelyn carried the same unwavering belief that kindness never lost its value, even when other people failed to return it. That morning he had struggled to catch his breath after climbing only a few steps inside their modest brick home on the outskirts of Richmond. His doctor had adjusted his medication and asked Evelyn to pick it up before dinner. She kissed Harold on the forehead before leaving and promised she would not be long. She even laughed when he reminded her not to forget the cinnamon rolls from the bakery across the street because Saturdays deserved something sweet. Remembering those words now made the paper bag feel heavier than it really was. Every passing minute meant Harold remained at home waiting, probably checking the clock beside his favorite recliner. Across the store, a little girl tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, is that Grandma in trouble?" she whispered softly enough that she thought nobody else could hear. Her mother quickly answered, "Do not stare," but the child continued looking at Evelyn with open curiosity rather than judgment. Evelyn met the little girl's eyes and offered the smallest smile she could manage. The child smiled back instinctively before her mother guided her toward another aisle. For a brief moment, warmth returned to the cold room. Then Linda Hayes broke the silence. "She was standing near the pharmacy shelves for several minutes," she said firmly. She kept looking around. Evelyn turned toward her. "I was trying to read the dosage instructions because the print is smaller than it used to be," she answered gently. "These old eyes are not as strong as they once were." Her voice carried no bitterness, only honesty. Even Officer Blake Turner seemed to glance toward the prescription label for a second before looking away again. Above them, the security cameras remained fixed on every corner of the store, recording every word, every expression, every quiet pause that human memory might someday forget. Evelyn lifted her gaze once more toward the small black lenses. She did not see machines watching. She saw witnesses waiting patiently for someone willing to ask the right questions. Officer Daniel Ridd folded his arms and looked across the counter with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed before asking questions. The pharmacy receipt remained untouched exactly where Evelyn had placed it, yet his attention lingered not on the printed facts but on the quiet woman standing in front of him. Around the store, shopping carts began moving again, but slowly, as though every customer sensed that something important was unfolding and did not want to miss the ending. The fluorescent lights reflected across the polished tile floor, making every shadow appear sharper than it really was. Reed finally broke the silence. Store security reported unusual behavior. "We have to follow up on that." His voice sounded practiced, almost mechanical. Evelyn nodded politely. "I understand doing your job, officer. I only ask that you look at everything before reaching a conclusion." Her words were calm enough to surprise even Blake Turner. The younger officer glanced briefly toward the security monitors mounted above the customer service desk. The screens cycled through different camera angles every few seconds, showing checkout lanes, the greeting card aisle, the pharmacy counter, and the entrance where Evelyn had walked in nearly 20 minutes earlier. "We can review the footage," Blake said quietly. Reed answered before anyone else could respond. "Later. First we complete our investigation here." Linda Hayes quickly agreed. "Exactly. That is standard procedure." Yet her voice lacked the certainty it carried only moments before. The pharmacist cleared his throat and carefully picked up the prescription bottle. "Everything here matches our records," he offered cautiously. "Mrs. Carter picked this up less than 5 minutes ago." Reed gave only a brief nod without acknowledging what the statement implied. Evelyn watched the exchange without interrupting. She had lived long enough to recognize the difference between people searching for facts and people searching for confirmation of what they already believed. The distinction mattered more than most realized. Her thoughts drifted for a moment to her son Marcus. As a little boy he had always asked endless questions before making up his mind about anything. He would spend hours taking apart old radios in the garage just to understand how every tiny piece fit together before putting them back in working order. Harold used to laugh and say that Marcus would either become an engineer or an investigator because he refused to accept easy answers. Even as an adult, Marcus still called every Sunday afternoon without fail. Evelyn smiled faintly at the memory before returning her attention to the present. Near the front entrance, an elderly veteran wearing a faded baseball cap stepped closer with a shopping basket in his hand. "Excuse me, officers," he said respectfully. "I have been standing in line behind this lady since she came in. She has not caused a bit of trouble." Reed acknowledged him with a polite but dismissive glance. "Sir, we appreciate your concern. Please allow us to handle this." The veteran hesitated, then slowly stepped back. His expression revealed disappointment more than frustration. The room grew quiet again. Somewhere behind the pharmacy counter, a wall clock clicked to the next minute. Evelyn could almost hear time slipping away from Harold waiting at home, wondering why she had not returned. Still she refused to let anxiety replace grace. She stood with her shoulders straight, her hands resting lightly beside the prescription bag, while the silent cameras above continued recording every choice each person in that drugstore was making. Evelyn slowly reached into her handbag and removed a small leather wallet that had softened with age from decades of careful use. Inside were neatly arranged family photographs, a library card, an old church membership card, and her driver's license. She placed the identification beside the prescription receipt without a word. Every item rested perfectly aligned on the pharmacy counter, almost as if she believed that order itself might encourage fairness. Officer Reed glanced over the license only long enough to confirm her name before sliding it back across the counter. "Identification tells me who you are," he said evenly. "It does not explain why the store manager became concerned." Evelyn folded her hands together. "Then let us find out what actually happened instead of guessing," she replied. "Please ask someone to review the cameras before this misunderstanding grows any larger." Her voice remained gentle, but there was unmistakable conviction beneath every carefully chosen word. Blake Turner looked toward the customer service desk where a monitor quietly cycled through live security feeds. "It would only take a few minutes," he offered. "The recording should answer most of the questions." Reed did not move. "We will get to that when we finish here." Linda Hayes nodded immediately, although uncertainty had begun to replace the confidence she displayed earlier. Several customers exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere inside the drugstore had shifted. This no longer felt like an investigation. It felt like a room waiting for someone to choose between assumption and truth. Evelyn carefully unfolded another piece of paper from her purse. It was a printed appointment summary from Harold's cardiologist, dated that very morning. The physician had circled the new prescription dosage in blue ink and written, "Begin tonight." She placed it beside the medication bottle. "My husband has been waiting at home since lunchtime," she said softly. "He depends on this medicine. I would appreciate being able to bring it to him before dinner." Her words carried no accusation. They simply reminded everyone listening that real lives continued beyond the walls of the store. The pharmacist quietly cleared his throat. "Once more. Everything she has shown is consistent with our records," he said. "There has not been any report of missing medication from this location today." Linda hesitated before responding. It was not only about the medication. She stayed near the shelves longer than most customers. Evelyn turned toward her with calm eyes. "I stayed because I could not read the side effects without finding better light. I did not realize that taking extra time would make someone fear me." The sentence settled over the room like a weight that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Near the entrance, the elderly veteran removed his cap and held it against his chest. A young mother quietly stepped beside him. "I saw her reading the labels too," she said. "She never hid anything." She was just comparing the bottles. Blake looked from one witness to the other before meeting Reed's eyes again. More than one person was now telling the same story. Above them, the security cameras continued their silent work, preserving every second that passed. Evelyn followed the tiny lenses with her gaze one last time before looking back at the officers. "The truth has been waiting above us this entire time," she said quietly. "All we have to do is be willing to look." Evelyn's words lingered in the air long after she finished speaking. No one answered immediately. The steady hum of the refrigerators along the back wall seemed louder than before, blending with the soft beeping of the pharmacy register and the distant sound of rain beginning to tap against the front windows. Outside, dark clouds had rolled over the afternoon sky, turning the parking lot a muted gray. Inside the drugstore, time felt strangely suspended. Officer Reed glanced toward the security office but did not move. Instead, he picked up Evelyn's driver's license once more, studying it as though another look might reveal something different. It did not. It showed the same name, the same address, the same quiet life that had already been placed in plain view. Still, he remained unconvinced. "Until we finish here, you will remain in the store," he said firmly. Evelyn nodded without protest. "I have nowhere else to be except home," she replied. "My husband is waiting for me." She looked toward the pharmacy clock. Nearly 40 minutes had passed since she first walked through the automatic doors. Harold would almost certainly be worried by now. He never called her cell phone unless something was truly wrong because he knew she preferred to keep it tucked away in her purse. She imagined him standing slowly from his recliner, walking to the living room window, pulling back the curtain, and wondering why her blue sedan had not yet turned into the driveway. The thought tightened her chest, but she refused to let it change the gentleness in her voice. The pharmacist quietly stepped closer. "Officer, if Mrs. Carter would like, she may use the store telephone to call home." Reed hesitated before answering. "That will have to wait a few more minutes." Blake Turner shifted uneasily beside him. "Daniel," he said in a lower voice, "we already have multiple witnesses, a valid receipt, medical paperwork, and security footage available. We should probably review the recording before delaying this any longer." Reed looked at his partner, then back at Evelyn. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face, but pride quickly covered it. Linda Hayes remained near the checkout counter, no longer making eye contact with anyone. Her earlier confidence had faded into nervous silence as more customers quietly gathered near the front of the store. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. They simply stayed, waiting to see whether fairness would finally be given the same opportunity as suspicion. A teenage cashier slowly reached beneath the counter and handed the pharmacist a small bottle of water. Without saying anything, he placed it gently in front of Evelyn. She smiled warmly. "Thank you, young man." Her gratitude carried the same sincerity she might have offered a lifelong friend. The simple kindness softened several faces around the room. Even the little girl who had spoken earlier waved shyly from beside her mother. Evelyn returned the wave with the smallest movement of her fingers. She understood that children often remembered moments like these long after adults forgot them. Above everyone, the security cameras continued recording in perfect silence. They captured the worried expressions, the unanswered questions, the witnesses who had stepped forward, and the elderly woman who continued choosing dignity over resentment. No recording could measure character, but before the afternoon was over, those cameras would reveal something far greater than where Evelyn Carter had walked. They would reveal who everyone else had chosen to become while watching her stand there. Rain tapped softly against the broad glass windows, turning the afternoon sunlight into a pale silver glow that stretched across the polished floor. The drugstore, once filled with the ordinary rhythm of weekend shoppers, had become almost unnaturally still. No one seemed eager to leave anymore. People who had finished paying quietly remained near the entrance, pretending to organize shopping bags while their eyes drifted back toward Evelyn. She noticed none of them with resentment. Instead, she simply stood beside the pharmacy counter, her hands resting lightly atop the paper bag that carried Harold's medicine. The bottle inside gave a faint plastic rattle as she adjusted it slightly, reminding her that every minute mattered. Somewhere across town, Harold was probably looking at the old grandfather clock in their living room. He had always trusted her completely. If she was late, he would never assume carelessness. He would assume that someone else needed kindness more than he did. That was the sort of man he had always been. Evelyn smiled quietly at the thought. She reached into her purse and touched the worn leather Bible she carried everywhere. She did not open it. She simply rested her fingertips against the cover for a brief moment before closing her purse again. It was enough. Blake Turner watched the gesture from several feet away. Something about it reminded him of his own grandmother, who had never entered a grocery store without carrying peppermint candies for children she had never met. He lowered his eyes, suddenly uncomfortable with how long the situation had continued. The pharmacist stood silently beside the counter, pretending to organize prescription forms that had already been arranged twice. Linda Hayes remained near the register, but her shoulders no longer carried the certainty they had earlier. The confidence that had accompanied her emergency call had dissolved into restless silence. She glanced once toward the security office door, then quickly looked away. The little girl who had asked about Evelyn earlier slowly walked back toward the pharmacy aisle while holding her mother's hand. She looked up at Evelyn and whispered, "I hope you get to go home soon." Evelyn's smile widened just enough to soften the sadness in her eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart," she answered gently. "I hope you always remember to be kind before you are certain." The child nodded without fully understanding, but her mother did. She lowered her head, thoughtful, as though those simple words had settled somewhere deep inside her. No one spoke after that. The only sounds came from the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the distant refrigeration units, and the steady rain outside. Above them, the security cameras continued watching with perfect patience, collecting every passing second without favor or prejudice. Evelyn lifted her eyes one final time toward the small black lenses. She was no longer waiting for someone to defend her. She was waiting for the truth to find its own voice. Somewhere far beyond the walls of the store, a cellular telephone began to ring inside a government vehicle traveling through downtown traffic. The caller identification displayed the name of the local police department. The man behind the wheel glanced at the screen for only a fraction of a second before pressing the answer button. His expression changed almost immediately. Without saying another word, he activated his turn signal, guided the vehicle toward the next intersection, and quietly changed direction. The quiet inside the drugstore was finally broken by the soft chime of the automatic entrance doors sliding open. Rain drifted in with a cool breeze before the doors closed again behind a tall man wearing a dark navy suit beneath a simple black raincoat. He carried no sense of urgency in his stride, only calm purpose. Water glistened on his polished shoes as he removed a pair of leather driving gloves and slipped them into his coat pocket. His eyes swept across the room once, taking in every face, every expression, every detail without appearing hurried. Years of professional training had taught him that people often revealed more in silence than they ever did through words. Officer Reid noticed the newcomer immediately. "Sir, this area is part of an active investigation," he said. "Please remain behind the front aisle." The man gave a polite nod but did not stop walking until he reached the pharmacy counter. His attention settled on Evelyn. For the first time since entering the store, warmth softened his otherwise disciplined expression. "Mom," he said quietly. "I am sorry I did not get here sooner." The room seemed to lose all sound. Evelyn looked up, surprise giving way to relief as a gentle smile spread across her face. "Marcus," she whispered. "You should be at work." He smiled faintly. "I was." He carefully picked up the paper pharmacy bag and checked the prescription label before setting it back exactly where she had placed it. Only then did he turn toward the officers. His posture remained respectful, his voice measured, his emotions completely under control. "Good afternoon, officers. My name is Marcus Carter." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a leather credential wallet. Opening it slowly, he held it where both officers could clearly read the identification. The gold badge reflected beneath the fluorescent lights. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Blake Turner's eyes widened almost immediately. Reed stared at the credentials for several long seconds before looking back at Marcus, as though expecting the badge to somehow change into something else. It did not. Marcus calmly returned the credentials to his pocket. "I received a call from my father when my mother did not arrive home with his medication," he explained. "He was concerned because she has never been this late without calling." Nobody spoke. Even Linda Hayes seemed unable to breathe for a moment. Marcus glanced briefly toward the security cameras mounted above the pharmacy. "I understand that questions sometimes need answers," he continued evenly. "Fortunately, this store appears to have an excellent camera system. I believe reviewing the footage will help everyone understand exactly what occurred today." His words carried no threat, no anger, and no accusation. They simply reflected confidence that the truth required no embellishment. Blake looked toward Reed again. This time, Reed did not answer immediately. The certainty that had guided every decision earlier that afternoon had begun to disappear beneath the unmistakable weight of facts, witnesses, and now the quiet presence of a man whose profession depended on evidence rather than assumptions. Marcus turned back toward his mother and gently rested his hand over hers. "Have they treated you respectfully?" he asked softly. Evelyn looked around the room before answering. "Some people are still deciding who they want to be today," she replied with remarkable kindness. "I think we should give them the chance to choose well." Marcus looked into her eyes for a long moment, then nodded. In that single quiet exchange, everyone standing inside the drugstore understood that the greatest strength in the room had never come from a badge. It had come from the woman who had spent the last hour refusing to let dignity slip away, even when every reason to lose it had been placed before her. Marcus waited until the silence settled before speaking again. He did not raise his voice or step closer to anyone. Years of federal service had taught him that calm questions often uncovered more truth than loud accusations ever could. "Officer Reed," he said respectfully, "would you mind asking the store manager to authorize a review of the security footage from the moment my mother entered the building until now?" Reed looked toward Linda Hayes. She hesitated for only a second before giving a nervous nod. "Yes," she answered quietly. "The recordings are stored in the security office." The pharmacist immediately volunteered to unlock the small room behind the customer service counter. Blake Turner followed him inside while Marcus remained beside Evelyn. Through the glass window, everyone could see the monitors flickering as the recording was rewound. The timestamp rolled backward minute by minute until Evelyn first appeared entering through the automatic doors with her umbrella folded neatly beneath one arm. The room watched in complete silence. The cameras showed her stopping to wipe rainwater from her shoes before walking slowly toward the pharmacy. She greeted the cashier with a warm smile. She spent several minutes comparing medication labels beneath the brighter overhead lights, exactly as she had explained. When she struggled to read the smaller print, she borrowed a pair of complimentary reading glasses from the pharmacy counter, thanked the technician, and returned them a minute later. She paid for Harold's prescription, accepted the receipt, carefully placed the bottle into the paper bag, and remained near the counter reading the dosage instructions one final time. Nothing about her movements suggested dishonesty. Nothing matched the suspicion that had filled the room earlier. Blake paused the recording and enlarged another camera angle. The image clearly showed Linda Hayes observing Evelyn from across the store before picking up the telephone and placing the call that brought the officers to the pharmacy. There was no missing merchandise, no concealed item, and no unusual behavior. Only an elderly woman taking extra time to make certain she understood how to care for her husband. The playback ended. The monitors went still. When everyone returned to the sales floor, the atmosphere had changed completely. Officer Reid stood motionless for several moments before taking a slow breath. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice noticeably quieter than before, "the video confirms your explanation. I should have requested the footage immediately instead of relying on assumptions." Linda lowered her eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I convinced myself something was wrong without giving you the benefit of simple patience." Evelyn listened without interrupting. She looked first at Linda, then at Officer Reid, and finally at the gathering of customers who had witnessed everything. "Thank you for looking," she said gently. "The truth cannot help anyone until someone is willing to see it." Marcus studied his mother with quiet admiration. He had expected frustration, perhaps even anger after everything she had endured. Instead, she offered the same grace she had shown since the moment he arrived. The little girl near the entrance smiled brightly and clapped her hands once before her mother gently squeezed her shoulder. Even the elderly veteran removed his cap again and nodded toward Evelyn with deep respect. Rain continued falling outside, but inside the drugstore the air somehow felt lighter, as though honesty itself had opened a window no one had noticed before. Marcus picked up the pharmacy bag and placed it carefully into his mother's hands. Harold was still waiting at home, and at last, nothing stood between a wife and the promise she had made before leaving that morning. Marcus held the umbrella over his mother as they stepped outside together. The rain had softened into a gentle mist, leaving tiny drops shimmering across the windshields of parked cars and the fresh green leaves lining the edge of the lot. Behind them, the automatic doors closed with a quiet whisper, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke. Evelyn held Harold's prescription close against her chest as though it were the only thing that truly mattered, because in many ways it was. Marcus opened the passenger door of his government vehicle, but before she climbed inside, Evelyn turned back toward the drugstore. Through the glass entrance she could still see Linda Hayes standing beside the checkout counter with her head lowered while Officer Reid remained near the pharmacy, speaking quietly with Blake Turner. Their faces carried the unmistakable weight of reflection. Evelyn did not see enemies behind that glass. She saw people who had been given an opportunity to become better than they had been an hour earlier. Marcus noticed where she was looking. "Mom," he said softly, "if you want to file a formal complaint, I will make sure the proper process is followed. Everything that happened today is documented." Evelyn rested one hand gently on his arm. "The process should be followed," she answered. "Not because I want revenge, but because the next grandmother who walks through those doors deserves to be greeted with fairness instead of fear." Marcus nodded slowly. That answer sounded exactly like the woman who had raised him. She had spent his entire childhood teaching him that justice was strongest when it protected everyone, even those who had once failed to protect others. As they prepared to leave, the drugstore doors opened again. Officer Reid walked outside into the light rain, removing his service cap before approaching them. He stopped several feet away, careful to respect their space. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "I know an apology cannot erase this afternoon, but I am sincerely sorry for the way I handled the situation. I should have trusted evidence before assumptions." Evelyn looked at him for several long seconds before offering a gentle smile. "Then remember today," she replied. "Every person you meet carries a story you cannot see. Listen to the story before you decide who they are." Reid lowered his head in acknowledgement. "I will." Linda Hayes stepped outside a moment later carrying a small white bakery box. Her hands trembled slightly as she offered it to Evelyn. "I overheard you mention cinnamon rolls for your husband," she said. "Please let me replace the ones your delay kept you from buying." Evelyn accepted the box with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she answered. "I hope the next person who needs extra time reading a label receives your patience before your suspicion." Tears gathered in Linda's eyes as she nodded. Minutes later, Marcus turned the vehicle onto the quiet neighborhood street where Harold had been watching through the living room window. The moment he saw Evelyn step out carrying both the pharmacy bag and the bakery box, relief spread across his face. He opened the front door before they reached the porch. Harold wrapped both hands around Evelyn's and simply whispered, "Welcome home." She smiled, handed him the medicine, then placed the warm box of cinnamon rolls on the kitchen table. Through the front window, the last rays of evening sunlight finally broke through the clouds, filling the small house with soft golden light. Marcus stood silently in the doorway, watching his parents laugh together over something only they understood. In that quiet home, surrounded by ordinary love, the greatest victory of the day was not that a federal badge had changed the room. It was that kindness had refused to surrender, dignity had remained unshaken, and the truth had found its voice without ever needing to shout.